Dishonest and false news has become all too common. More alarming, some media outlets publish
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Post-Truth Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Johnny. I'm, of course, Zinni. And then we've got Professor Glenn Jellenik here. He is an associate professor of English at the University of Central Arkansas. He serves as the graduate director for the Master of Arts in English and teaches classes on 18th and 19th century British lit, literary theory, and film and literature. He continues to emerge as a major scholar of adaptation studies. He also co-edited and contributed to the Adaptation Before Cinema, Literary and Visual Convergence from Antiquity through the 19th Century. And he once was a professor of mine at the University of Central Arkansas. So we're happy to have here today. It's really it's an honor to have you here because it's kind of come full circle, and I realized recently how much I appreciated the things you taught me to do. And so, yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of give your self-description because, sometimes these is, it's great words, but sometimes, like you said earlier, we often have a lot of identities. So.
Now, did you write that, the intro?
No, my chair.
Yeah.
Wrote that. A lot of time. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
It's great to be here. A lot of times in life we're asked to toot our own horn, and I don't know. I think most of us are uncomfortable doing it. Those of us who aren't uncomfortable doing it end up being the ones who get ahead, unfortunately, sometimes. But like I was saying earlier in a conversation earlier, we have so many different identities, many different people. So that's one of my identities is mild-mannered.
Well, you're also a New Yorker,
professor.
though.
Also a New Yorker.
Yeah. We were talking about that a little bit. I think when we first met, I could hear it a little bit in your voice there. So, I mean, tell us about coming from Brooklyn and ended up here.
Yeah, it's and this is a question that most Arkansans ask at some point. It's like, what are you doing here, right? The accent comes out when I talk about certain things, or if I go back to New York, then it comes out full blown, especially if I'm driving.
Road rage.
Exactly. It just all of a sudden it's there, and you're angry, and you know.
Now, is Arkansas driver, because Arkansas drivers are pretty rough on the road, but does it compare to New York or different?
I mean, with New York, it's just volume.
Yeah.
There are just so many cars. There are just too many cars. I like the way New Yorkers drive. They're super aggressive, which I'm comfortable with. I guess it's where I learned to drive, and so it's what I'm comfortable with.
You won't get anywhere otherwise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Arkansas drivers are not overly aggressive. I find them very polite drivers. I have no problem driving here, and the traffic isn't bad. Right?
Yeah.
Well, people aren't used to heavy traffic, and so they kind of spend most of the time on an open road. So I feel like a lot of Arkansas drivers, when you think they're being mean or aggressive, they're mostly just not even paying attention. That's kind of the worst part.
Yeah, I have no problem with the drivers. I mean, I think everywhere you go, people complain about drivers. No matter where you are, if you go to New York right now, people will tell you New York drivers. Well, we usually say New Jersey drivers are horrible.
Yeah.
But everywhere you go, people say, "Oh, the drivers here are
LA's
the worst."
the worst, though. That's what they'll say.
Yeah.
Right?
And unless you go to Rome, and then they'll say, "Oh, the Romans are the worst." But yeah, I'm sure the drivers in LA. But I think it's a factor of being in your car too much and too many damn cars on the road.
That's right.
But so how did I get here?
Yeah, how did you get here? From that traffic to this traffic.
From that traffic, dense traffic, to this very sparse traffic. When you work as a college professor, when you want to work in that field, you go where the jobs are. It's not like other professions. You get your law degree, you hang out a shingle and decide where you want to work.
So I want to move to Chicago.
Exactly. And then you look for jobs when you get there, right? If you're an engineer or a nurse or, those careers, you go someplace and you try to get a job. That's not how it works with university jobs. University jobs, every job is a national search. And so you just apply. So, in my little blurb there, I am, my research focus is 18th and 19th century British literature.
Wow.
That's going to be a pretty niche thing, even within universities.
Yeah.
So basically, where there's a job opening, you apply. And then you go where the currents take you. My wife is also a college professor, which then complicates things because then you got to find two jobs. And so Arkansas is the place, Conway specifically, where we both found jobs in the same place.
And how long ago was that?
12 years ago.
Okay, so you're doing it. That's pretty good. That's to stay at one place that long. That's,
Yeah. Well, and it's a factor of our children were growing up. We wanted it to be as stable as possible for them. We were living in South Carolina, but my job was 2 hours away from where we were living. Her job was in town, in Charleston. I was teaching in Columbia.
Not a bad place to live.
Yeah. Charleston's a really nice town.
It is, yeah.
Although I have to say I prefer Arkansas.
Yeah. I like it here too. I think, we talked a little bit. I lived away a long time, but being back here, I really like it. It's a great state to be, you know.
People are nice, and that goes a long way.
Yeah.
I also think there are lots of opportunities here, and that goes a long way. We were talking earlier about living in New York, and there are advantages to being able to get anything you want,
Sure.
anytime you want it.
The pizza and the bagel.
Exactly. The pizza, the bagel, go to whatever movie you want, go to see all kinds of live entertainment, and feel like everything's happening all the time. And that's fantastic. I love that. You're not going to get that here.
Yeah.
The thing that I've realized coming back, you don't do that stuff that often. I don't.
Yeah.
That's
true.
We had 2 kids when we moved here. You go to work, you come home, you get them fed, you put them to bed, and then you go to sleep yourself. And then you get up the next day and you go to work again.
Yeah.
So it occurred to us that what really mattered was your job, your family, and your house. Those are the places where you spend 90% of your time and about 98% of your energy. And so
you get a lot more of that here than you would in New York.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you spend more time at your home, and
yeah.
I'm sure you have a larger house than you would a condo or an apartment.
Yeah. Well, we were in Colorado before, so we've bounced around a lot.
Yeah.
Is the bottom line. Academics tend to bounce around a lot. That's what you do, and then you find a job that you like in a place that you fit, and then you stay there for as long as you can or as long as you want. But so we were in Colorado as well, and we lived in tiny places. It was beautiful. It was an amazing. I would move back there if I were rich.
Sure. What part of Colorado was it?
Boulder.
Yeah. I love that area.
Yeah, it's great.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
But so we ended up here. And I ended up in Arkansas for the University of Central Arkansas, where I got my job.
That's great.
Well, I wasn't aware that your wife was also a professor. Where does she teach?
She teaches at Hendrix.
Okay.
She teaches French literature.
Okay.
At Hendrix, she is the French department at Hendrix,
wow.
Small school, and she's fantastic at what she does. And so we cover both sides of the channel.
So the French and the British.
Exactly.
You get a lot of infighting at your house there?
Yeah, and what's funny is she's not French. And I'm not British.
Yeah.
These are just the things we've studied.
Yeah.
But we tend to go back and forth. We're geeks. We're literature geeks.
Yeah.
So we have some romantic conversation.
Yeah. What we argue more about is like who innovated free and direct discourse, Gustave Flaubert or Jane Austen. That's what passes for like heady debate in our house.
Gotcha.
And it was Austen.
So what drew you into that specific era of literature and genre? Was something you read that just kind of pulled you in there? Or
well, when I went to grad school, I was reasonably sure I was going to study 20th century American literature. But I was really interested in adaptation. I didn't even know what it was called, but I just knew I was interested in it. I knew I was interested in the sort of making of films out of other stories and the retelling of stories. And so that's what I had sort of set on doing when I went to grad school. And then I started to take classes in a bunch of different time periods and in England as well, in Britain as well as America. And I started to realize that what I was seeing in film had happened already in literature, that these things, and so that's what that book is about. Adaptation Before Cinema is about the idea that adaptation goes way back further than film adaptation of novels, which is what I was interested in when I started grad school. But so I kept getting sort of pulled back further and further into literary history, and found a real affinity for the 18th century, and these 18th century, particularly the novel in the 18th century.
Is that because there were a lot of adaptations that happened in that period? Or
well, yeah. So the 18th century is to be nerdy, to be
that's what we got here.
Yeah, you're in
exactly.
a good room, I think.
But the 18th century in Britain is many things literarily, but one of them is the rise of the novel. So the novel rises as a genre. The novel goes way back, but it crystallizes as a genre in the 18th century. And when it does, they are retelling stories and they're adapting things in those early novels. And then those novels are being adapted
Yeah.
into plays at
Now,
the
when
same
you say
time.
they're retelling stories, are they retelling like oral stories or past literary stories, or what are we talking about? I mean,
Both.
okay.
Sometimes.
Do you have a really prolific example that anyone might know? Just, I mean, is there some, you know, like,
Well, so Don Quixote,
okay.
which is Spanish and earlier,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't consider it an adaptation specifically of a specific story, but what it is a story about a guy who's reading chivalric novels, Arthurian legends,
Yeah.
all of these Arthur tales.
Yeah.
And he begins to internalize them and believe that he's a knight himself, and so he's going through, and so they're retelling some of those stories as
Yeah.
they go through. There are all kinds of.
That's a good one. I think
yeah,
most
yeah.
people will know that one when they hear that.
Yeah,
That's,
exactly.
Yeah. And like you're saying, it took all this sort of mythos from culture, right, and past history, and turned it into a novel,
Exactly.
a new telling, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
and then specifically to tell the story of the burgeoning middle class in Britain. So poetry and epic theater was for the aristocracy. The novel emerges as a literary form that is for the middle class.
I see.
That is for these people who are now getting some education. They read them. Everybody read them, but these novels were written toward a middle class audience
Because they could read them, right?
for the first time. Really, for
Yeah.
the first time.
It's only like what 200 years before is when the first Bible was printed, right? And so then mass circulation, and I'm sure definitely
That's what, the Gutenberg, I think? Is that right?
Yeah, the Gutenberg Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure definitely like what you're talking about of like taking these stories and giving them. They probably were mostly reading their Bibles at home, right? And so then finally something fresh, like these other stories that aren't just ancient stories, but could broaden their understanding of the modern world.
Absolutely, and the change to vernacular literature, right? And so that idea of translating the Bible. So there's the Gutenberg Bible, but then there's also the translation of the Bible into vernacular, into Italian, into English, into French,
right.
not Latin, which would be the language of the educated, which would be the language of the aristocracy.
I see.
In order to get an education, in order to go to university,
Yeah.
you had to be from the upper class. As they start to as capitalism rises, essentially.
Yeah. Well, the emergence of technology.
Yep.
The capabilities of publishing, right? That's
Yep,
like makes it all
technology
possible.
and
Yeah.
economics.
Yeah.
So that all of a sudden different people are making the money.
Sure.
And there's a broader reading audience. So the 18th century, we actually see the rise of mass culture. For the first time, what we might consider mass culture, as opposed to a monolithic culture, a uniform culture, right?
Yeah.
Where if you were to read before the 18th century, you were educated, you were an aristocrat, you had gone to university, you had learned to read, you had
Sure.
learned. In fact, they didn't even study literature, what we would call literature, at the university level. They studied the classics. You would study ancient Greek and Latin.
Sure, yeah. We're going to read the Odyssey and yeah.
In Greek.
Yeah.
And then was Shakespeare revered by the aristocracy at that point?
Yeah. So and he would be a more organic intellectual, not an aristocrat, but writing for an aristocrat. Well, his audience would be
kind of bridge that
everybody.
blue collar gap, right?
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
And the theater could provide that.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't written. None of Shakespeare's plays were written in his lifetime.
Right.
They were only written down after he died by
crazy.
the actors.
Yeah.
And so, since it was performative, that was one of the first places where multiple classes would go. So, working class people would go, but aristocrats would go as well. But then, as the 18th century unwinds, we start to see a reading audience. That lower reading audience begins to get enough education to learn to read and have free time and money.
It's interesting.
So I kept getting sort of pulled back into there to start thinking about how stories are repurposed and what happens when they are.
It's all about how the lens that the story's being told, how it's who the author is, what is the foot they're putting forward, what's the point of view. I mean, I could see why you'd be drawn to that, because as a period in time, it seems like pretty vital importance to sort of the shift of culture between this upper class and lower class, and kind of how that brought them closer and probably created struggles in different ways and maybe inspired revolutions in other ways. But I'm sure a lot of that, was happening all at that same time because of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those things are connected, right? I mean, all things are connected all the time. But that idea of who's telling the stories, who's reading the stories, what are the stories about, the idea of literature and these storytellers emerging at the same time as these revolutions are occurring in thought, in technology, in economics. These things are all connected. And so, as I approach literature and culture, I like to think of it as a part of everything else. I don't, I think often we're encouraged to think of, like when we think of Shakespeare, right? We think of these books that we put up on a shelf. They're dusty. The language seems inaccessible. It's old. But literature, when it's
But the plays are so fun. If you go see Shakespeare, you're like, this is really good.
Yeah, and it's universal, right? That is supposed to be the idea, that these stories tap into something universal, something that isn't aristocratic or lower class or middle class. It is all those things.
Well, it's all the genres that you feel like, sometimes I feel like he invented.
Yeah.
The romantic comedy. It's like, that's...
I know.
I mean, it's like, where did that come from?
Do you feel
the
like
tragedy, the...
Do you think he's one of the best early examples of a good adapter? Because he took historic, like you said, he was almost quintessent. He took historic, but also stuff that was archetypal, and then put it in theater, right?
He did more than take archetypal things. He literally stole plays, right? So Romeo and Juliet is an Italian play that he just retold. And so, there's a great novel by Dickens called Nicholas Nickleby, where it's about theater. And Nicholas Nickleby is working in a theater, and they're talking to this guy who's an adapter, who adapts these plays. And Dickens hated adapters because there was no copyright at the time. So what they could do was they would take, he published his stuff serially.
So plagiarism happened all the time.
Yeah, well, it wasn't play. It was just, so he would publish his stuff serially, which would mean it would come out a little each week. He would publish it in magazines.
Yeah, like comic books now.
Exactly. And they would start to adapt it and make plays out of it before he was finished writing it.
Crazy.
And he had no...
Let's see, where did that just happen? Game of Thrones, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of thing was legal, and so he hated adapters. So he has a character in Nicholas Nickleby called the Literary Gentleman, who is a playwright who adapts other novels, essentially. And
that kind of rings a bell. I had to take theater history a long time ago when I went to college, but that name, I kind of remember that. Yeah.
And so Dickens hates the guy, and so he's making fun of him. The guy's name was actually Moncrief, was the guy who did it to Dickens. And so, but the character Nicholas is talking to the Literary Gentleman, and he's talking about Shakespeare, and the Literary Gentleman says, "It's true. Bill was an adapter," but he's making the case that he's better than Shakespeare, and Dickens is making fun of that. But
well, there's always theries about Shakespeare now. I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
It's like, who wrote it? Who's the author?
That
is
he's
this
not the real writer.
Are they all the same guy?
Are there other plays that have Shakespeare's stamp?
And it's interesting to hear what you're saying because, well, who knows? I mean, really, based on that, what you just described. You could have 50 plays, and they may be written by 10 people, for all we know.
Absolutely.
But they embody the idea of Shakespeare, right, and sort of what he did. So.
And they are adaptations, right? So he's constantly he's adapting history, like you said. So he's writing history, but he's also literally adapting other plays, just taking them, but putting them in new contexts, and just having written them at the end of the 16th and in the early 17th century, they're going to have something different about them, and that's what energizes me with the subject. Is that you can never just retell a story, because you're always telling it to a different set of people in a different moment, and differences are going to occur. So there's the what's the Psycho? The Alfred Hitchcock.
Which we did in class.
Yeah, exactly. And then Gus Van Sant in 1998 remade Psycho. And he said, I'm gonna make the same movie again.
Yep.
And he used the same script. He used the same shooting schedule. He used all the same camera angles and
crazy.
everything, but with different actors. And 38 years later,
Yeah.
and the question was, is it going to be a different movie? And the answer was, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Of course it is, because
it's not as good a movie either.
it's definitely not as good, and the performances probably aren't as good. But also, just things change. It was Anne Heche was Marion, and you can see these differences. They're using the same script, but even as she's going through it, and in interviews, she talked about, like, you can't do this anymore, just simply because of the fact of Psycho.
Yeah.
You can't check into a motel anymore,
Right.
and not be a little sketched out by the clerk.
Right.
In 1960, you could. It was before
That's a
Psycho, not just a
different-
more innocent time,
Yeah.
but before Psycho.
That's back when everybody did that.
Right.
It's like, yeah, we go to the motor lodge.
Exactly.
That's just what
But
we do,
after Psycho, anytime you're in the sort of with the,
Yeah.
that guy's going to be creepy.
Yeah.
So, thinking about how when we retell stories, what happens as those stories are retold for a new audience, what gets activated, what gets pulled back, those are things that really interest me.
Yeah.
Was the newer Psycho, was it set in a modern day setting, or was it still set in the time frame of the original, like the historical time frame?
It was set in modern, but
Yeah, like current time.
the costume designer didn't know that. She thought that it was set in the 60s, and so there's a really but it is
That
a
seems like
90s.
something Gus Van Sant would do, though. Like, not tell the costume designer on purpose. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
He makes these weird experimental type films, so it's not surprising he'd be the one to do that. You know?
And it was the one he made after Good Will Hunting, and it was sort of the classic one for you, one for me.
Yeah.
You know, he made Good Will Hunting, and it did really well. And they said, okay, now you can do whatever you want, right? You can do something experimental. You've made something very mainstream that made us a lot of money.
Yeah.
Now make your art film. And that's what he wanted to do. So I think it's a really interesting movie. For me as a scholar, interesting is better than good.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a good movie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting talking about movies because obviously so much of what you do in the adaptation world and sort of describing how, I guess, that literature world was working back then was sort of copying and stealing and things like that. I mean, the studios do that now. They find out, okay, Universal's going to make a volcano movie. Warner Brothers, okay, we're going to make one too. It's like constant. It's just, we were having that conversation recently because you find out, they made Ford versus Ferrari. Now we've got to go make Ferrari. It's sort of this constant borrowing. I guess that's just a part of, I don't know, art and literature culture, because I'm sure you see it happen in books as well, right? It's
absolutely, and I think it, because we know that film is an industry, but so is literature, and so I think what you're touching on is the industrial concept, right? So how do we end up with two movies about Steve Prefontaine in the same year? Somebody that nobody outside of track and field has ever heard of, but then there are two major movies about this runner.
And they are Chariots of Fire. I don't know.
No, that one, it's after Chariots of Fire. But yeah, and
that happens all the time, though.
Right, and it does because because.
I mean, the best example would be Marvel and DC.
Yep, and the idea is that movie studios are risk averse. So. But they also need to innovate. So
someone's buying this product. Let's go get some of that market.
Bingo. Yeah. Or, look, this movie's being made. It's safe for us to make ours, right? Yeah. And so this idea of, hey, the water's fine, come on in. And I think, so since it's an industry and they really want to make money, but that doesn't mean filmmakers care about that. I'm sure they do. But they could care about saying something original, something new, something interesting. But movie studios, they're there to make money, and so we're going to see people doing the same thing. If it works, do it, right? The superhero movie at the beginning of the 21st century was a risky endeavor. Now it's risky to make a movie that's not a superhero movie. But you see the same things.
I think
in
that's
literature.
starting to turn, though. I've just like the most recent. I think it was the most recent Aquaman. Has hardly made anything.
I haven't seen.
And the most recent Marvel. Because there for a while it was like, oh, well, Marvel movies do well, DC movies don't, right, or don't do as well. But even the latest Marvel film, not doing so great. You know, the latest Aquaman not doing so great. I think those might have run their course, maybe. I mean, which isn't surprising since we've had so many the last 10, 15 years.
There's a saturation point for our society, and I think a lot of people just turn where, you know, at the beginning of the 21st century, it was edgy to say you like superhero movies. You know, people like to be innovative. They like to be in the vanguard. They like to be out front. At this point, you know, we have a distrust of that which is overly popular often. For a while, we don't. We love it, and we get on, and we ride the wave. But then it becomes less chic to go to those movies. Or it could be Aquaman just isn't very good. But I think it's not just movies, right? I haven't seen it, so I don't know. I'm not saying Aquaman's
I haven't seen the new one, but yeah.
But it's not just movies, right? It's TV shows,
Sure.
It's books, it's you know, it's all kinds of things. So there's a saturation. But again, like you were saying earlier, it happens in literature too. Absolutely. There are fads. There are things that, and so you talked about Shakespeare inventing the romantic comedy. He didn't, right? There were ones before him.
Yeah.
The Greeks had them, but he has perfect romantic comedies, and then so does Jane Austen. Jane Austen's novels are perfect romantic comedies, and yet now when we look at that genre, we think of it as this sort of disposable thing, this thing that, well, it's just a romantic comedy, right? But we would never say that about a Shakespeare play or a Jane Austen novel. So genres and then specific topics, they in literature and in all storytelling, they become, you know, really hip and fun, and everybody's engaging with them, and then people back off of them.
Yeah. Do we need to take a break? Are we good?
We got
a minute. So,
minutes.
well, I mean, I don't know what you're thinking, but I was thinking I want to kind of hear your take on Dune because, you know, obviously, massive, you know, literary collection of books there, novels there from Frank Herbert, right? You had the experimental David Lynch version, and now we've got the sort of more modern, you know, take on it from Villeneuve. Like, what is your thought on, you know, how, I guess, the point of view of the artist being the director, you know, of the film can so radically interpret literature in different ways? Yeah,
and I find I call those adaptation cycles, and I find those cycles fascinating. Right, the idea of like different artists who get to. I think of movies, literature, as narrative forms. Right, so they're storytellers. And when you have a story, so you have Frank Herbert as a storyteller. Then you have David Lynch as a storyteller. And then you have Denis Villeneuve as a storyteller. And that, like you said, they're all different artists. They're all different people, different genres, different moments. And so, looking at what Dune means in 2021 versus what Dune meant in the 1970s versus what Dune meant in the 1980s. Is that's the bread and butter of what I like to do. Yeah. So I find it a really fascinating set of text. I think it's interesting how things. I think you have to put Dune in conversation with Lord of the Rings based on the way they're making the movie, because I almost feel like the first Villeneuve Dune wasn't a standalone movie. Right, it just kind of ends. You're watching
part one, right?
Yeah, if you've read the book, you know, and I think Lord of the Rings did that to an extent, right? They filmed all three at the same time. It did, but they felt kind of more final. Exactly.
Because it was the book, right? I think,
Yeah, and it felt like each one was based on one single book, and they felt like each kind of standalone movies. I feel like Dune was more of that, and also I think it's competing with long-form television now.
Yeah, you're right. It's like we're in a 2-year intermission. You kind of leave it, and you're like, okay, I want to watch part 2.
So I think that's a fascinating way to adapt, right? Knowing that you have a text, you've gotten a director and set of filmmakers and actors that you know are going to get greenlit again. And so you can tell that story in a way that it is, you know, when it ended, and I was thinking, I know the story. I've read it, and I've seen and I was thinking, that's not the end of this, even this section of it, right? It would just sort of end it, which I find fascinating that they know the confidence that they know they're going to be able to take more time.
They knew it was so good that they could do that.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's what I felt. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
You know, I think I walked out thinking this is the best movie I've seen in like 10 years.
Nice.
And I don't know why I thought that, but I just kind of did.
Yeah.
You know,
And I think, and again, I think like with long form television, like these TV series that function as, I think, like single stories, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, Mad Men.
Yeah.
You can take your time
Yeah.
telling the story of The Wire, right? Where you take your time telling that story, and I feel like that's what Villeneuve was able to do.
Yeah.
Is take his time with this story. You don't have to rush things in, and that's
Yeah.
a very different type of adaptation, right? Because most of the time when we think of adaptation, we think of it as a digesting, right? You have a 400-page novel, and now you're going to make a 2-hour movie,
Yeah.
right? A 120-minute movie, which is a 120-page script. That means you have to condense, you have to cut things out, you have to streamline, you have to
In his case,
merge
it's a
characters.
180-page script, right? Or
Yeah, the
3
movies are
hours
getting
or-
longer.
Yeah.
But knowing that you are able to take your time with it, and obviously Dune is these are long novels.
Well, there's still stuff he can't put in the movies because, like you said, there's just too much material.
Yeah.
So they have to decide what are we going to focus on here? Right?
Absolutely.
But yeah.
But so and I find that really interesting that you. So yeah, of course, you're still going to have to pick and choose. You tend in movies to have to make the central characters more prominent than you do in a novel. But that said, the ability to take your time with it and to really, especially for a movie like Dune, and a franchise like Dune, to take your time and create a world.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's when you're walking out thinking that's the best movie I've seen in 10 years. I think that's what that's what I'm feeling when I feel that way. Is I've just been taken to a world. I've been allowed to be there for 3 hours, and I really like having spent time there. Right. Instead of, I was on a journey, I went on a roller coaster ride and then I got spit out. It's that inhabiting of a cinematic world that I think great movies do, whether they're romantic comedies or epic fantasies.
Yeah,
great.
I was listening. I think it was a podcast I was listening to, but he was talking about how, like, when we watch a movie or do anything, our brain creates a cognitive model, right? And then we go visit and we exist in that place. And especially when we see it in a movie, we're experiencing it physically, right? When you're reading a book, you're just kind of like relying on your imagination and your previous, what you've experienced before, right? To then build a mental picture. But then when you're in a movie, your body will react, right? You know it's not real, but you're allowing yourself to kind of immerse yourself in it. And then he was going on to talk about how then, despite we know it's not a movie, our brain holds on to those cognitive models, so then we experience reality. He was talking specifically about UFOs or paranormal sightings, of like how the reason it's so different is because we all watch this. We watch different stuff, we read different stuff, we have different interests, and so then when we experience something unknown, our brain just goes, oh, well, if it's aliens, well, is it the type of aliens from Star Wars? Is it the type of aliens from this or that? Right, and
robots.
So then we create our definition of reality almost based on the cognitive models we've received from culture. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah.
I find the
hence why we have 2 different versions of Dune.
Yeah, exactly. And then the idea of what Danny's talking about is the idea that we there are millions of different versions of Dune, the novel, right? Because each person who reads it is going to create their own cognitive model of that. But the Coleridge called this the willful suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic faith. Is how he put it, and it's the brain's. I know, right? Because he's a poet, right?
I think I had that in a test one time.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea is he was a philosopher as well as a poet, and he was trying to figure out how imagination works. Like how can we, like you said, we know it's a movie, right? We know it's not really happening, and yet it can have visceral effects on us. It can affect our body. Our pulse rate can quicken. We can cry, for flickering shadows or just words on a page. And so, our brain's ability to create models, to create things that aren't there, right? The ability of our imagination, which is all the things that we're talking about so far today, are in the realm of imagination. The ability of our imagination to sort of take over our understanding of the world is absolutely incredible, and it's what we do when we read, it's what we do when we watch a movie, but it's also what we do when we invent things. It's also what we do when we practice our religion. It's what we do all the time, where we create these models with our brain, with our amazing gray sponge up there in our head,
Yeah.
and we create models out of that, and then those models actually do organize our world. And so, yeah, that turn from this thing that we've imagined, this story that we've been told, and then that turn that we can make to make that thing real as far as how we organize our world. I don't understand how it happens. I'm not a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
But I do enjoy it every time I experience it, and I'm in awe of it.
Can I come audit your class? Is that
Absolutely. The more
let's
the
take
merrier.
let's take a quick break.
Yeah, we'll
So
do a quick
just
break and
continue.
we'll be right back.
Yeah. So in your obviously you've been a professor for a number of years now. What do you see the shift in the students, the new batches of students showing up to college? Like what? There's been a lot of change in the past 20 years just with technology and social media, you know, that changes how we learn, it changes how we think, what voices we accept into our lives. And so what do you see from that for that teacher side?
That's a good question.
How has the human mind changed?
Yeah. I don't think it has. Is my short answer is I think students are students. Students are students from school to school. But there are local differences, right? And so I've taught at private schools. I've taught at public schools. I've taught honors classes and I've taught gen ed classes. But I feel like students are students. Curious students are going to be smart and engaged and interesting and interested. And then there are going to be students who aren't that. So, but I do think there have been changes in how we go through our lives. So I would say, like, the easy answer is attention spans are tougher to deal with.
Yeah.
At this point, attention spans have atrophied.
That's for all of us, right? I mean,
For all of us, it's not
yeah.
just students. But so showing, giving students a 400-page novel now is difficult. Giving students a 3-hour movie
Yeah.
is difficult. That said, once they get into it, I find that the students that I'm getting right now are bright and engaged and really intelligent.
Yeah.
And those were the students that I was getting in 2015, and those are the students that I was getting in 2008.
Yeah.
So I feel like I don't feel like our brains change as fast as we think they change. From an
Yeah.
evolutionary perspective. But practice, yeah, I think attention spans are definitely
that-
The
something to grapple
landscape
with.
changes.
The
right?
landscape, and that's something that we were sort of touching on. This idea that the attention spans are shorter, and so is that suspension of disbelief harder for us, for everyone, right? We think about all the media we're constantly bombarded with, whether it's I could stream 100 TV shows from any different distributor, or watch any movie I want, or this movie's not any good because I know it's bad acting, or I don't like this writing. I mean, that the idea of the suspension of disbelief has become a challenge in culture, right? From
Do you think it's disbelief paralysis? Like I feel like because we've been inundated, and maybe I feel like in antiquity culture and literary classics, you have a attempt to lead people, right? You're speaking to people who are not very educated, and so you're trying to raise their consciousness. But like now we're so inundated with stuff that's engaging but doesn't go anywhere. So I feel like there's a lot more. Either we've been so paralyzed by all this stuff that we won't put ourselves in the position of the thing he was talking about, where it leads to poetic faith, or where it opens us up. I forgot where I was going with that.
Oh, well, I think where we're going is we want to hear you tell us what you think, because you're the scholar. I mean, that's this whole idea of post-truth world. It's sort of like, what does that mean, and how does that inform everything, and how does that challenge us in a different way?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, just because you could call me a scholar doesn't mean I know anything that you. Well, I mean, I might know some local facts that you don't, because I've read some books that
Let's
you
put it
haven't.
this way:
but
you could put that on your business card, and I can't.
yeah,
so.
exactly. Well, you can in a post-truth world.
It's like Esquire, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, I think what you're pushing on is really interesting, and in a lot of ways. And so in one way, I totally get what you're saying, this idea of Well, and we were talking about this earlier a little bit off mic. The idea that there's so many different things to choose from now. The world is less monolithic. Even when I was a kid, there were only a few channels on television. Everybody watched the same things.
Yeah.
Everybody watched the same movies. Everybody saw the same commercials. Everybody heard the same songs. Now, with the internet, there's the possibility that people can see all kinds of things. Everything is there. That said, we still tend to gravitate toward the same. Everybody still tends to listen to Taylor Swift, just like everybody used to listen to Michael Jackson. And so in one way, things are more diffuse, and there is less of a center than there used to be, for sure.
Yeah.
And that maybe makes it harder for people to that idea of suspending disbelief. But I'd almost also in a lot of places in our society, especially on the internet. I mean, how many times have you spoken to somebody from your own base of knowledge and been completely wrong about something?
Yeah.
Because you read it.
Sure.
And believed it. And it just wasn't true. Or spoken to somebody who was that way about something else, and where you're like, where did you hear
it's
this?
This idea of adaptation, right? Like that's going back to that. It's like let's say we all witness an event happen, but we're all standing in a different place on the street.
Maybe
we all have our
prior facts of the situation.
Yeah,
a little bit of
we have different
leading up
contexts,
knowledge,
right?
Yeah.
And we all describe it differently, and that's firsthand knowledge.
Yeah, and then
But
it gets into the
from
spin room.
Yeah, then it goes to the next narrator, and they write their own version. So it's really that we're in that weird place in time where we don't always have the complete picture, right?
Yeah.
So, thinking from your point of view, being so deeply into adaptations and what that means, and sort of, what does that make you think differently about the world today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just whether it's adaptation or just storytelling in general, right? I think this is one of the developments and sort of insights of modern literature. And maybe even it goes back before then, but I'm thinking about, when you were just talking about something happens on a street corner and different people see it, I was thinking about Rashomon, the Kurosawa movie.
Yeah, sure. It's a great one.
Yeah, which is all about different perspectives on a single event, and then different versions of that story, which, some people who don't like the term adaptation prefer the term versioning, right? So it's different versions of something. Because, and so the idea that there are so many different versions, you were talking about the unreliable narrator earlier. The idea,
I feel like our world's full of them now.
Right, and that's what we're dealing with. And so, but in a way, I think maybe we're more credulous. We're more willing to suspend our disbelief for something, maybe not for everything, but we have to believe. I think we as a species need to believe in something, right? I guess there are people who say they're nihilists and they believe in nothing, but I don't really.
That's what they believe in, though.
Yeah, but they believe that that's an ethos, right? But
just makes me think of the Big Lebowski.
Exactly. At least it's an ethos. But we need to believe in something, and so in absent a central thing to believe, think about an internet rabbit hole. Really intelligent people go to bed believing the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah.
Right? Really intelligent people, come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories or engage with conspiracy. QAnon is a huge thing. And so if we're talking about post-truth society, a post-truth world, we're almost
we're ready. We're eager for that.
We need something. And in the absence of, so that everything's so diffuse, keeps us like trying to grab onto handholds and footholds to climb. And so we're willing to grab things. Sometimes those things are reliable, and sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
And so we have more conspiracy theories now than ever, in a world where we're supposed to be more discriminating than ever with regard to what's true and what's not. And I think maybe it's our brains aren't prepared to deal with the internet.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, hearing you talk about it this way, it's about that belief, right? The suspension of disbelief, and also the action of belief. Whereas, centuries ago, millennium ago, there were very few things to believe about. I believe in the sun. I believe in this book. and that's all there was, right? Whereas now there's so many different things you can grab onto. So
you can learn about new things you could believe, right? Like, I don't think many people come naturally to nihilism where they just wake up and go, I'm a nihilist. They hear about that. Maybe they have a circumstance in their life where they start, and then they realize, like, oh, well, that's what I am, so I cling to that.
So how does this impact the way that you see literature now? I mean, understanding that your real focus is on a certain era of time.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously are still in tune with what's going on. So I mean, how has this world impacted literature today? Are you seeing different types of stories emerge? I mean, is storytelling changing at all in the written form?
That's a great question. I think this is that idea of an unreliable narrator. Whether a narrator is reliable or unreliable, a narrator is somebody who has the story and and is coming at it from a specific perspective, and then we are given access to that perspective. I think we all are narrators in our own lives, and so I think about the way I see the world, right? And the way I see the world tends to be as a synthesizer. I like to see things and say, oh, that's like that, or that's similar to that, or that reminds me of that. That's how I tend to process things, is look for patterns and then think about synthesis. And so when I look back at literature, I tend to synthesize it. And so it would be more sort of along the lines of there are these two basic ways to see the world. Nothing ever changes, and there's nothing new under the sun, or naught may endure save mutability, right? Is the Shelley line that change is the only constant. Either things are constantly changing.
Is that from Frankenstein?
No, it's Percy Shelley. It's her husband.
Oh, okay.
It's from a poem called Mutability.
Gotcha.
But it's the idea of that change is the only constant, right? And so things are constantly changing. But then the opposite of that would be there's nothing new under the sun. Everything is constantly
both could be true at the same time.
Right? Yeah.
That's the cyclical paradox, essentially, where by changing, everything remains the same by always changing, but the fact that it is always changing means it's producing something novel.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with Terence McKenna?
Mm-hmm.
His novelty theory is one that is very inspirational.
Yeah, McKenna, that's just a quick pause. I'm not hearing you. Just
You're
want to
not
make sure that you're...
Check.
I hear you now.
I'm
okay,
hearing.
You're good.
Okay, sorry.
You're
maybe
good.
Maybe I got away from the mic a little bit.
Well, good. We'll cut around that, but I just want to make sure.
But yeah, so with regard to that, I tend to be there's nothing new under the sun kind of person that we keep repeating. So with regard to that, I see when I look at older literature, 18th century, 19th century literature, I see a lot of the same things that we're doing still today, that we maybe do in a TV show, but also in literature, in movies. So I'm not sure that it's changed all that much. And
there's only so many basic stories, right? It's those archetypal stories that Plato and Aristotle talked about. You've got the tragedy. I mean, you know them all, right? That's
yeah.
The romantic comedy, like we're talking about. I mean, there's 5 or 6 of them, right?
Yeah, there are like 14 different stories. But either way, even within that, right? Like we were talking about earlier, you can tell the same story in a different place, and it's a completely different story, right? There's a great short story by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer.
Oh yeah.
And it's called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, and it's about this French writer. It's an obituary for a French writer. It's a short story, and the guy's masterpiece, according to the guy writing the obituary, was he rewrote Don Quixote, the novel Don Quixote. He rewrote it in the same language, in the same order.
What?
But so and he rewrote it in the 20th century. It's a short story. It's fiction.
Yeah.
But the idea was that, it was so hard to do that he was only able to do 2 chapters of this 1,000-page novel, and and he wrote in 17th century Spanish, and basically, and the idea was, and then the obituary writer is saying, and Menard's Quixote is way better than Cervantes' Quixote. But it's the same words in the same order. It's the exact same thing. But the argument from the story, the joke that Borges is telling is that once when you retell something in another context, it's going to be different, even if it's the same.
Depends on who the audience is, right?
Yeah,
That's the time. Yeah.
Or I don't know if you've ever had the experience of watching a movie or reading a book. The movie hasn't changed, but you have.
Yeah.
Right? And so you watch a movie when you're 18 years old, and then you
Yeah.
watch it again when you're 30 years old or 25 years old. It's a different movie.
Totally.
Right? Because you're a different person. And
I
so.
always think about Clockwork Orange with that.
Oh my God.
So I saw the movie first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I was always a huge Kubrick fan. I still am. And then I read the book.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, damn, the books might be better than the movie. You know, although it made me really respect the movie even more because it was so true to the book and the voice of the book. But then if you rewatch it now, it's still amazing, but I feel different about it than I did back then, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and I kind of, if you were to ask me, would I rather watch the movie again or go read the book again? I think I would want to go read the book again. It's just something about it. You experience things at different ways in different times.
Yeah.
Like you're saying.
And also with regard to, that's an extremely disturbing movie.
It is.
I mean, it's a disturbing book too. Like you said, Kubrick hews pretty closely
The book has
to
more
the book.
humor, though. The humor doesn't come through as much in the movie, right?
And also, it's a very different thing to see something than to read it.
That's right.
So if you've ever seen American Psycho
Sure.
or read the novel
Yep.
American Psycho,
Very different.
yeah, I mean, and the film, the movie is kind of funny and but
It's hard to get the humor because it's so dark
yeah,
than the movie, right?
and
It's like
the book is just brutal. It's about a serial killer,
Yeah.
and it describes in depth. But you couldn't film that. There's
Yeah.
no way to film that
impossible
and
to
have
film.
people continue to watch.
Yeah.
So I think the same thing for
Well, some things read better than they watch, and Easton Ellis to me is a good example. I mean, I love his stuff, and it's the reading of it is enthralling. The watching of it is a little bit tougher.
yeah, and
You know?
and you just can't, right? So
Yeah.
so what passes for the violence of Clockwork Orange when you're reading violence? I'll talk to my students about this, and I think what we're talking about, a lot of what we're talking about here is media literacy, right? Is understanding this idea of a post-truth world, understanding what's true and what's not, understanding what you can have faith in and what you can't is much more difficult now
Yeah.
than it was in the past because there's more information circulating. But also this idea that information is different based on how you take it in, so that the example I always use is Ray Rice, the football player Ray Rice, who was
He got suspended for domestic violence, I think, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
he hit his girlfriend, so he was suspended. And they said, okay, that's it, Ray. You can't hit, domestic battery. This is bad. He said, I did it. He had a press conference, and the NFL said, we're going to suspend you because you can't hit somebody. That's no good.
Yeah.
We're going to suspend you for a game, right? And this was, everybody knew he did it, and he
Yeah.
admitted to doing it and had a press conference. And the NFL said, we're going to suspend you for one football game because you can't do this, and we're very strong on domestic violence. Then TMZ leaked. Apparently, he had hit his girlfriend in an elevator
I
think in Atlantic City.
Yeah.
And TMZ leaked the footage. So all that changed.
Went to a year suspension. No, I don't know what happened.
His whole career.
His whole career.
He never played again.
Yeah.
So it went from a
Crazy.
game to his entire career based on a seeing.
Because you can see it. Yeah.
He said, I hit her. I am sorry. She was there next to him when he said it. I punched her. I was, it's unforgivable what I did, but she's trying to forgive me, and we're trying to move on. And they said, a game, shame on you.
That's crazy. That's only a game.
Right.
Yeah.
But then when people saw it, seeing him
Totally changed it.
completely changed it. So, but we
Yeah.
all knew there was nothing different in our minds to what we knew happened.
Yeah.
But seeing something is very different
Yeah.
than reading something. And so seeing Ray Rice hit Janae Parker led people to say, you're done. You're
Yeah.
never playing again.
That reminds me, it's kind of like the Vietnam War,
Absolutely.
Yeah, like once they started putting that on TV,
Mm-hmm.
it just totally changed everything. Up until that point, it was just, oh, you're reading about this war in Vietnam and it's far away. And,
Yeah, or World War II, where you would see things on Movie Tone News that were highly edited, and you would see them weeks after they had happened.
Highlight newsreels.
Yeah, exactly.
With the fast talking.
Yeah. Now on the Eastern Front. Yeah.
It definitely seems like today, because me and you were talking about it, and you noticed it, and other people are noticing it, and definitely people who, let's say, want to push bad things, or like the news media, they start. It seems like the thing now is let's show it to you first, this horror, and we're not even going to give it a narrative. We're just going to let it spin, right? So they probably paid attention to incidences like with the Ray Rice thing, and let's show them the video first. Let's not give them explanation. Make everybody horrified, and then people then start to argue, and then it's like we don't even have, I feel like, we're better at analyzing literature and coming to a degree of conversation about it than we are even about current events, right? Because everybody's got an iPhone now, so there's 100 perspectives of something, plus the idea of, like, I don't know, we have these media sources, and you were talking about it earlier, as we get diffused, we seem to double down on something, right? We need something strong and firm to grasp on, and so then we end up with, we're now in a society where we're all doubled down in our rabbit holes, still trying to go about the same world. What are your thoughts about that, like, disconnect and how it relates to modern events?
Yeah, I feel like...
Also, what do you think about turning it off?
Yeah.
I used to watch it, and I stopped about 6 months ago.
Well, that's my motto is don't click. Right?
Yeah.
Don't click. Like, when you see the video, you know what it's going to be. I watch very little news. I read a lot of news. But then the hyperlink, I read on my computer. But I never click on the hyperlinks, ever. Because of what you just said, Zenny. I don't want to see it. Not that I want to bury my head in the sand and ignore what's happening, but once seen, things can't be unseen.
Yeah.
And this idea of, I think personally, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and I am somebody.
What is that? We don't even know what that is anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And I am somebody who believes that you can get to small t truths, right? That there are facts.
Sure.
But the way I kind of see what's happened in our society is the media and social media has a business model. And that business model is predicated, in my mind, on upsetting us. Right? The more upset we are,
That's right.
the more we will keep going back, right? I think it started with sort of Columbine for the mainstream media, and then September 11th.
It's funny you bring that up, because I talk about that with friends sometimes. It's one of my first real TV memories. It's weird that when your TV memories are violence. I think my earliest was, seeing the bombing of the Middle East on CNN when I was like 7. And that's not because my parents were like, hey, come watch this. It was just sort of, they were watching that, and I happened to walk through the room. And it's like, what the heck, right? And then but the Columbine, having that televised, and the way that these things are televised now, and that you're right, it started around the 90s, right? That's when they really started putting that out there.
Yeah. And
before that, you had, like, serial killers, right? So you had people, like, in the 70s, right, when they first had our first celebrity killers like Manson or some of these other guys. Like, before then, we didn't talk about it, we didn't televise any of it, but then that created a whole new thing where we can televise, not even the violence itself. First, it was just, let's put them in the courtroom and these outside things. That's just really...
Yeah, that's something, I guess, that's still confusing to me, is why violence and the topic of violence is pushed so much in our culture because we, looking back at the stuff that you're really an expert on, the 18th century, 17th century, things like that wasn't as prevalent back then in that material. It's right. I mean,
the discussion of violence. Yeah, I mean, we certainly haven't invented violence in the 21st century.
It's in the Bible, right?
Yeah,
but it's not.
And if you look statistically, our lives are significantly less violent now than at any other time in human history. However, we talk about violence openly more, and we're able to see violence, like you said. Serial killers in the 70s, right? There are people,
like a fad almost.
Yeah, committing like this horrific violence, but you couldn't see it. You didn't see it, and when they talked about it on the news, they didn't show it, right? And so this idea of the internet, and now I think the mainstream media trying to catch up with the internet for dropping the filters. Right. One of the things that we talked about earlier, one of the things that happened as mass literacy happened was the dropping of the filter, right, for religion specifically, where you prior to mass literacy and the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages, you would have to go to a priest to talk about the Bible. You couldn't read it. So you didn't read Latin or Aramaic.
Sure.
So you couldn't read it. So the priest would be your filter for the religion. The priest was your go-between for you and God. And then the idea of, especially the Protestant idea of the translation of the Bible, is we remove the filter.
Yeah.
You can take the Bible home. You can read the Bible,
can
and
go
you can
directly to
decide.
God.
Right, and you can decide what it means.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that the internet has done with the world, is taken away the filter that the news used to have. Where, okay, here's Charles Manson, but we're not going to show you Sharon Tate.
Yeah.
You're not going to see that on the news. Now you see it. There's footage of Kobe Bryant's body, right? That people take a picture, everybody's got a camera on their phone, everything is everywhere, and we can see everything, and we do.
Well, going back to the Manson thing, it's like back then, yeah, there wasn't. Now there's movies about it, right? Now we've got like, here's an adaptation of the thing that happened from your favorite director with your Hollywood stars, and we're gonna make up our own version of what happened.
Or Tarantino,
That's what I'm talking
who
about.
creates a fantasy, that saves Sharon Tate. You know, his stories
Once
are
Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I feel like that's a kind of a trilogy. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Inglourious Bastards, and Django Unchained. I take as like a trilogy
fictionalized history.
Yeah, right? And fantasy.
Yeah, fantasy.
Right, fantasized history, where we get the ending we want. The plantation, Django blows it up.
Yep.
We don't need the Civil War.
Yep.
Hitler, Goering, Goebbels are killed.
Gone.
And Sharon Tate is saved, right? So we get these histories, but are adapted in such a way that give us this happy ending.
It's funny because I've never thought of those as a trilogy, but the two of my favorites of his movies are Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained. So, I mean, that makes sense.
And he goes to the two sort of darkest moments of the last 200 years, right? Slavery and World War II, the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And goes directly into it, and then gives us a happy ending for each of them.
I'm sure for you, seeing films like that is exhilarating, because you're so into that mindset of adaptation. For you to watch a movie like Django or Inglourious Bastards, you probably have all this stuff running through your mind of things you've read, and they pulled this from here and this from here.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean, it's an amalgamation of all these different stories, and
Yeah, spaghetti westerns, especially Inglourious Bastards. Well, both of them, but Inglourious Bastards is playing with spaghetti western a lot. Django Unchained is literally Django was a spaghetti western.
Yeah.
But so like being the film geek and going through that, but also back to the suspending disbelief. When we're watching, we are suspending our disbelief as we watch. We're engaging with the story, but our brains are so quick that we're also playing with. So thinking about Inglourious Bastards here. Thinking about it as a story of World War II, where Hitler's a character, and as I'm watching that movie, I'm playing with I'm engaging with the movie and the characters, but I'm also playing with the story itself in my mind and thinking, well, how does this go wrong?
Yeah.
It has to go wrong because that's not how Hitler died.
You got to have a 3-act play, right?
So I'm sitting there going through it, and so the ending of that movie, spoiler alert here, just cracked me up. It blew my mind, and I literally laughed out loud in the theater as they're doing what they're doing at the end of the movie, because it can't happen in the story in my mind. The story that I'm trying to complete in my mind is, how does this go wrong? And it doesn't. And then you think, and so things like that I find just phenomenal when a storyteller can take me, manipulate me in such a way, carry me along, pull me into the story,
suspend your disbelief, right? Where you're not just like, this is boring, I'm going to walk out.
Right, and then carry me in so far that I engage so much that there's like a loud response from me in the theater where I just went, and laughed out loud and thought, this is the greatest thing. Some people don't like to be manipulated by storytellers. I love it. And thought, this is the greatest thing. But that ability to play with truth, with what is fact and what is not. And surprise us with it.
100%. The first few minutes of that movie, I was just, it's The Dirty Dozen. I've seen this. And then it's like, well, no, not quite. It's it takes its own path, which does really draw you in and has a lot of rewatchability. It's one of those things that you can just, this is great. There's some things you can put on, and we talked about The Lord of the Rings earlier, and maybe we'll get into that more, but those are movies I could just put on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, yeah, that's, you know, something that always suspends my disbelief.
Yeah.
Because they're so fantastical.
We need to take a quick break to get the recording.
Part 3 coming up next.
All right, and we're back live. So one quick topic. We don't have to stay on it too long because I'm not trying to get anything too controversial. But I grew up in a pretty Protestant, let's say fundamentalist religious background. And when I went to college, where I come from, college is definitely viewed as this place of, like, they're going to go and they're going to pick apart your beliefs. And it does make you question, right? So it's like any good teacher should. And if you're educating yourself well, you should constantly be questioning yourself. But through classes like yours and others, made me look at even like books like the Bible, right? And say, I came from a very literal perspective to, and people don't even understand the word literal. Literally means in a literary fashion. So when they say that, they're not actually, most of the time, not even looking at the Bible from a literary perspective. But I definitely learned about that book. I think it's a great book. I mean, any beliefs aside, I think it's great because you can look at it from so many different lenses, right?
Well, I mean, I think a great book's an understatement. Probably the most important book in human history, right?
Definitely Western civilization, for sure.
Yeah.
But definitely and this may take a sec to explain, but like you were talking about, we've had these central avenues of where we kind of all meet and learn belief, and definitely the era of, like, let's say the Protestant Reformation, it was that drop off of, like, we've had this Catholic framework and, you know, ancestry. What I grew up and experienced was that in that Protestant drop-off, it's like people were given free reign with that book, but then they lost a lot of tools of understanding, right? Because when you look at, let's say, teachers of Antiquity, when they were analyzing, they had a lot of different ideas about the book that are now starting to re-emerge as we didn't believe the authority, we dropped off, we kind of learned our own way, and now we have this product where we're getting more access to information, older information, rediscovering ideas. And it seems kind of like that way with the internet, and not to draw on too long here, but we've had another consistent stream of from books, newspapers, but now we're having that drop-off again, and it seems the drop-off is not just about religion and, like, metaphysics, it's back to the earth is flat. We've had this drop-off where we have all the information we could get, but at the same time we're starting to distrust what we thought was fact for hundreds of years. So yeah, what are your thoughts on, like, that kind of like that text, and then how that kind of leads up to where we are now?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, and I think there are, like, similitudes between the two things that you were just talking about. So, in my mind, but so the idea of I draw a distinction between organized religion and spirituality. So I think what you were talking about there were kind of like two different things, right? There's the church, and then there's spirituality. So the idea of, like, so the in theory the concept was remove the filter from the text, and then you are open to the spirituality. But in my mind, religions are more about power than they are about spirituality. And so the having that filter there was a way of controlling. And now we have other ways, religions have other ways of controlling people. And I think we see the same thing in the internet, right? The idea of, like, there's the idea of power. So the internet, as like the Bible as a book, is as important a book as we can find, right? Because everybody's read it, because it's been around for thousands of years. It is, you can't overstate its importance, right? But then how is it used, right, by various churches, by various synagogues, by different people use it different ways, and some for spiritual reasons, and some to aggregate power.
Yeah.
And I think the internet is a similar tool to, it's not a single book, but it is all books, right? And so we could use the internet to do anything, everything, all of human history and human thought is there, and we can access it. That is amazing, right? That what do we do with it is a very different thing, and I think how the internet is monetized, how it is all about power, right? Is all about aggregating power for a specific set of people. And at that point, then so the idea of, like, the difference between spirituality and organized religion, You can go on a spiritual journey with the Bible, or you can be told what to do by your church through the Bible, right? When you're told what to do through your church by your church through the Bible, that's power, right? They are telling you what to do, and they are organizing your life according to how they want you to be. Social media companies, the companies that run the internet, are using the internet not as a repository of information and as this infinite almost tool. They're using it as a way to sell us things, narratives, but also products.
Also control what you do and do not see.
Yep.
And like you say, the internet's infinitely powerful. But when we go to Google and type in a topic, we're going to get the same 10 things every time.
Exactly.
Unless we go to page 20 and try to find something different, right?
Yeah.
So,
and in that case, there's too much stuff to find.
Yeah.
But so back to your original idea, Zenny, is the idea of like when you go to college, when you go to school, what the idea of critical thinking, right? To my mind, critical thinking shouldn't, as I go to in a class and everybody believes different things in a classroom, I'm not there to convince anybody of anything. What I'm there to do is to get people to question. And when you've been told not to question things, to question that, right? And so I think that within a spiritual context, questioning is good, right? Within some religious contexts, questioning is seen as bad.
That's when the church splits.
Right.
You look at those early days of Christianity.
Right. And if the ideas are strong, then questioning it's the idea of steel sharpening steel, right? That you're not going to hurt you when you are making a sword. You're hitting it with a hammer. You're not hurting the sword. You're sharpening the sword. And so my idea is that by looking at things critically, you should be strengthening the ways that you're seeing the world. And so that idea of critical thinking, I think, is something that often people from outside the university see the university as weakening people to go back into, whether it be a church, whether it be somebody's family business, the farm, wherever it is.
Yeah.
And I see it as, no, you're strengthening people's ability to think and understand the world. If the ideas that you are exploring are good ideas, it's only going to strengthen your understanding of them, which is going to strengthen your belief in them. So yeah, that idea of sort of a media literacy, where we get to the point where we feel like we can't trust anything, right? Where if you read enough, somebody's disproven this and somebody's disproven that, and then you start to feel, and so that idea of post-truth, right? If we get to a point where there's no small t truth, where there are no facts, that can feel like a really destitute world where you can, and that I would think is dangerous.
It's interesting because, for a period of transition there, science was becoming the emerging religion. Sort of like, okay, well, we can grab onto science, and that started in the Enlightenment and all that, and it's really led us into where we are now. But the issue now with science is now we have all these what are considered wild theories that haven't been proven. We think they might be true, right? And so I feel like the world, in a lot of ways, is, at least for the educated, we have been looking more to science as that maybe new religion. But the issue we're finding now is that there are tangents of science that require a little bit of faith. And
maybe physics.
Specifically, especially the quantum side and all these other things. And so it's interesting to see how these ideas emerge and evolve and change. And so, science especially, we know a lot and there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah.
And that idea where, well, who's going to decide and determine what is in fact, right?
Yeah. And so, yeah, I think science is predicated on faith. In that, back to what we were talking about earlier with the imagination, right? So if you think about scientific method, right? So you observe the world, and then you hypothesize, and then you experiment and try to prove. And so the hypothesis is faith. You're imagining something, right? So here's this thing, and now I'm going to hypothesize what that phenomenon was caused by.
Mm-hmm.
That is an act of imagination. An act of imagination is something that you cannot prove. But then the difference I think that science comes to is that when you say theory, scientific theories are different than like my theory on something, right? Scientific theory means it's been tested again and again, and so something isn't considered valid in science until it can be repeated. And science leaves it open. If you can prove that this isn't true, then it isn't, right? And so yeah. But the fact is, we do need to believe in things. And for most of us, for many of us, science is something that we have faith in, right? Where I take a pill, I don't know how that pill works. I don't understand what is in that pill, but I trust that pill is going to get rid of my headache, right? That
it usually does.
Yeah, and that is in essence an act of faith. It may be a little bit different than the faith that we have spiritually, but only a difference of degrees maybe. But I've heard people recently talking about so like you said, from the Enlightenment forward, science it's been this battle between science and faith, right, and spirituality. What I'm hearing now as we get, and this, I don't know if this is different than science, but that technology is the new religion, right? This idea of like science having been this religion, medicine and scientific advancements, and that now this. Do you know how the internet works? If you know,
I still don't understand how Wi-Fi works.
Exactly,
no
none
sense.
of us do, and yet this is this thing that has come to take on such a huge portion of our lives. We're buried in our phones. We're constantly on these screens. We're constantly, and this idea. This is the thing. And then when that is the case, when technology is our new religion, what happens when the information that technology passes on to us is only as reliable as we deem it, right? Where we say, well, I choose to believe QAnon, right?
We discount the human error, right? We think because it's in a different format and because it's all accessible, that somehow, I mean, that's the mistake we make with science, is that, we've done these tests, but things like Schrodinger, right, or in quantum physics, it's like, well, yeah, you did that, but does that really mean that it's so, like...
Yeah, the one thing I'm always drawn to is the uncertainty principle. It's like, well, I'm here to observe. I wouldn't know otherwise. So talking about technology, what is your thought about how stories may shift or change as we get more into this AI, machine learning? Maybe not. I don't want to necessarily hear your stories about how students are plagiarizing or having Chat GPT write their essays, but more so like I'm sure they are. But at some point, the human element may become the editor of stories that are being written by robots. And that was a big fight in Hollywood recently. It was sort of like, what is a writer? Are we allowed to have AI write a bunch of scripts and then we pay the writers to come in and edit them? I mean, what is your perspective on this?
And it's not just writers. This would be all intellectual property. This would be almost every job that we do. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And so one of the big focuses of my research is the concept of originality. And so because when you deal with adaptation, this is the criticism that we get of adaptation. Why can't they come up with their own story, right? Why do you got to tell somebody else's story? Why do they always this comes from that book?
Seen this movie before.
Exactly. Remakes and adaptations are often positioned by society as a lack of originality. There are only so many stories, and we've given up on saying anything original, so we just retell the same stories over and over again. And I don't agree with that. I think it is original to retell stories, and I think who would say Shakespeare isn't original, right? We all would say, oh my God, the guy, he was so, right? And yet every single one of his plays was an adaptation, right? Was a version, was told and retold.
He was the editor, right?
Exactly.
He put it all,
Yeah, and yet he innovated things, and so what you're pushing on with AI is this question of originality, right? The AI can write stories now. They can write movies now. They can write television episodes now. They can write novels now. They can write music now.
But they're really just aggregating ideas.
And so
and then aligning them in such a way, because like I heard about this guy who. He and another guy got this AI together to create millions of songs, essentially, and it's counting up every day. but it only creates that song by creating some sense of the different types of songs you can have based on, I guess, what do you call it?
Algorithms.
Right.
Parameters,
There's
yeah.
1, 2, and then there's 1, 1, and then there's 1, 1, 2, right? You create just all these possibilities, but that's not quite the same as whatever that human element is. And in some ways, you know, in the past, I mean, to this day, we're kind of like that that AI, because, I mean, inspiration itself is you're taking in the world around you or other people's ideas and then passing it through whatever your mind
Whatever your
is,
filter is,
right?
yeah.
That's exactly what Alan Turing, as he was theorizing AI in 1950, wrote an essay on computers, on computer intellect. And that was his idea. So the idea of originality, he said, well, this term originality is it's philosophically flawed. It doesn't make sense. He said, what I think you want to say. So the idea was, can AI, can a machine create something original? And he said the word original is too fraught. What we need is a more specific term. And he said, I think what you're asking is, can the computer surprise us? Can the computer do something that surprises me? And he said, absolutely, the computer can do that. But this idea of recycling and aggregating, which is what AI does. And so when my students, you know, enter a prompt in and get an essay back, all they're getting back are other things that have been published on the internet and have been written there, and then putting it in an order to answer the question that I've asked. And so it's that idea of aggregating versus creating. But what Turing said in his essay was what Zenny was just saying. Isn't that what we do? He said, you know, so when I come up with what I consider original, basically I am taking what is biologically in my brain and what I've been taught, and I am filtering it just like the computer is doing. It's this. So what we consider original is also a repurposing of things that we know, things that we've heard, and things that others have thought. And so it's
an incredible thought. I mean, and it hits it on the head, really.
Yeah, but that said, I think we're all uncomfortable with the idea that maybe that we won't be the storytellers going forward. That, you know, the writer's strike in Hollywood, I think we all have affinity for that. The idea of replacing humans or turning humans into proofreading monkeys, right? Where we just say, okay, let's just.
Well, that's where the point of view then becomes so much more powerful. It's sort of like, okay, yes, we have this aggregation of ideas. The AI is going to do this aggregation and put it into a story, and then I, as the supreme intelligence to the robot, am going to shuffle it and change it how I want to fit my point of view, whatever that narrative should be, right?
And I will be the editor of it rather than the creator. And what would happen? And I think maybe some of our discomfort and fear of this comes from and this is one of my pet theories, is that we as humans, we tell stories. That's what we do. Right, we are. Salman Rushdie called us the storytelling animal.
Yeah.
Right, the only animal.
The shadows on the cave.
Yeah, the only creature in the world that tells itself stories to understand what kind of creature it is. Right, and so this is what we do. So we understand science through stories. We understand politics through stories. We understand religion through stories. We understand history through stories. The word story is literally in the word history. So this telling of stories is something so fundamentally human, so attached to who and what we are, that the idea that going forward there's something else that would be telling these stories and that we would no longer be necessary in that is an existential crisis, I think. But also
it is
the idea that maybe these that there would be, back to there's nothing new under the sun. If all AI is doing is scanning what's already been thought and said in order to say something else, it's just, like you said, it's just putting the notes in just a little different place. And maybe, as Turing says, that's what we do too. But that's not what it feels like, right, when we do it.
Yeah.
But we know when the machine does it, that is what's happening. And that's pretty sad to think that all the stories have already been told and all we're going to do is reorder some of the word, the word order.
I can see how this could become a pretty obsessive branch of education for you, just based on, what you're already doing and your clear point of view on stories and adaptations. I mean, this topic is just going to become more powerful over the years ahead, right? I mean, it's
Yeah, and have you heard it's the I want to say it's called the 28 Club.
have not.
It's
No.
the AI songs by The Doors and Jimi Hendrix
Okay.
and Janis Joplin and Amy Winehouse. 27 Club. Sorry, not 28 Club.
Oh, okay.
All the musicians who died at 27.
Mm-hmm.
They developed an AI that could write songs.
Write songs.
And
Yeah.
Nirvana. So there's a Nirvana song. There's a Doors song. And they got cover bands to sing them, but that were written by a computer, and they're not bad. And they wrote the music and the lyrics, and
It's pretty wild.
the
stuff.
Nirvana one is actually a pretty decent song. I hate
It's
to
just
say
not Kurt
that.
Cobain, though,
Yeah.
right?
It's not
Yeah.
Kurt Cobain singing it. It's
Yeah.
a cover band, but. Or have you heard the mashups where they'll use an AI version of Frank Sinatra's
Yeah.
voice to sing?
Yeah.
You know.
I've probably seen some of those songs you're talking about.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
You come across those.
Yeah.
It's like, here's a new one by this artist.
Yeah,
Right.
and that idea of the deep fake as we get into like
Yes.
the post-truth world, right? Where this is another thing in where you can use technology in such a way to make anything look
Yeah.
real.
Well, I saw this happen. I think we all did. I don't know. In the last year, there was a picture that trended that was a bombing at the Pentagon, and for a few hours, people thought it was real, and it was an AI photo. Things like that. The lines are already getting pretty blurry. There's so many things out there where people are sort of like, is that really this person, or is that a video of them that someone's faked? You start talking about world leaders.
Yeah, and you
Did
need
this
like
person?
Yeah, I saw an ad on Instagram where it was literally start off a Joe Rogan clip, and then it transfers into a gambling website where they took a real clip and then they made a fake version of his voice promoting this gambling. So I was like, I listen to Joe Rogan. He's not going to go on and just advertise a gambling app on the Apple Store.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, that stuff is it's nuts, and you almost have to be not everybody's going to be able to become a digital forensics person, right? Because definitely with the war in Ukraine, I've seen a lot of videos of like it's coming to bear, and it's almost I feel like going to backfire for the people that are exercising it. But it's like we're watching this clip of this building blowing up, but then it takes a digital forensics person to go in and say, well, this doesn't fit right based on picture frame and GPS coordinates,
Yeah.
or sometimes it's a video game footage that they edit to look so realistic it looks like a real, whether it's a conflict or whatever. What do we do? What are some practical tools that you think that like in this world where almost again we're back to it's not Latin anymore, but it's technology,
Version 35,
magic technology,
right? Yeah.
That where unless you speak that code and you're going to be a digital forensic expert, like what can we do to reliably find sources of information that we can depend on?
That's a great question, and it is one of the things. So, I talk to my students, and I think, okay, you're in a class where we're going to read books, and we're going to watch movies, and we're going to talk about them. But, it's not us hanging out here just talking about books if you're going to get 3 college credits for it, right? It should be about something else. And so, the idea is it's about critical thinking, and I think media literacy. But like you said, that's getting harder and harder, right? And so and this is a slippery slope a little bit, but what I try to talk to my students about as they're watching a movie, say, is I want them to ask themselves questions and trust themselves as they're watching, right? And so when we're watching the news, I think we do the same thing. But so the idea of like, what did you see and what do you think it means, right? So think about what you saw and what you heard and what you think it means. What jumped out at you? And so I think we all have the capacity, the natural capacity to take in these stories and to try to comprehend them and to put ourselves in the place of them and to practice empathy through them. We do all of those things whenever we're watching a movie. And then think about trying to pull out what the arguments of the movie are, what the movie is saying, how it's positioning you. We're not always going to agree on those things. That's why texts are fun. The Bible is what makes the Bible such a plastic text, right? That you can read it and see one thing, I can read it and see another. Millions of other people can read it and see all kinds of other things, right? But each of us is filtering it, like Turing was saying, through our own experience, through our own knowledge, and through our own brain. And so as my students are watching movies, I want them to be thinking about What jumps out at you? What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And how are you understanding it? I think the idea of media literacy is practicing that with media. Like we often want to believe that which is too good to be true, or that which is fun, right?
We think we're the enjoyers, but we don't see the active players of like, that didn't go in that movie for no reason.
Right.
It's a high production. It's all thought out. Like,
Yeah, so think about it and what's it doing there. Critically think about it. So same thing with media, right? As you're on the internet, as you're watching the news or reading or scrolling Instagram, right? Think about what's there. Like you said it just a minute ago, Zenny. Joe Rogan is not going to be endorsing this gambling website, right? That's not going to happen. But there's no way for you to distinguish with your ear because of the technology.
Yeah.
But
it appears real.
Yeah, but your knowledge, that would be critical thinking to my mind. You thinking, okay, where is this obscure website going to get the money? And then the idea is, so one of the great things that I think, one of the funniest things about the internet, as they were developing it, one of the arguments in favor of the internet, as it was, they were like, this is a giant repository of knowledge, this is going to be incredible, and other people were like, well, this is going to be dangerous, this is going to be problematic. And one of the things that people thought pretty consistently across the board in the early days of the internet was, this will put to rest the ability to lie. Because everybody can fact check everything.
Yeah.
And so you won't be able to lie anymore because people can just look it up.
Now
and
you've
now,
got 20 facts.
now go fast forward 40 years, and you're like, yeah, it's the exact opposite. Lying is so much easier now. But that idea of...
It's Rashomon again, like you said.
Exactly, the different versions. But the idea, it is, a lot of these things are really verifiable pretty quickly. Whether or not Joe Rogan endorses this company, you hear it, you say, that doesn't seem right. A really quick, of course, Google is not perfect because it is curated, but a quick internet search would tell you, no, that is a hoax, right? That isn't true. And so my idea for, and it is far from perfect, right? But it's this idea of consulting your own brain and saying, okay, so the idea of crisis actors in Sandy Hook, right?
Yeah.
The conspiracy theory that Alex Jones got sued for $1.4 billion or however much money he lost. It was easily verifiable that wasn't the thing, right? You could find that those people all lived in Newtown, Connecticut, right? And so his conspiracy theory was easily debunked, so easily debunked that he is now bankrupt, right? But for continuing to push that conspiracy narrative. But that idea of looking at the media, looking at social media, looking at the information we take in with a critical eye, and then doing a little legwork, right? And so, I think the problem is sometimes that legwork pulls us down rabbit holes. Rather than toward clarity.
You get it. My favorite thing now is the fact checker thread, and then somebody fact checks that one, and you're just like, what the hell am I reading here?
And like you said,
synthesis of like we in the scientific community, it's clear we want to arrive to a point where we agree, and then we establish boards to approve what gets printed. But then we're back to the Google thing where it's like, what gets printed is what's curated. Right? So
by the way, all these companies are owned by 10 corporations. Right.
Yeah.
So then you get a whole nother bag of tricks.
Oligopoly, and an oligopoly on what we know, which is, it's dangerous enough. The idea of like certain companies controlling, sports or whatever, right? But
now it's on information.
Certain companies who control the flow of information. That's terrifying when we're all way more dependent on that type of information than we were in the past. It's a huge challenge. But that idea of like teaching critical thinking, right? Thinking about like, doing the smell test. Well, that just doesn't seem right. And maybe it is, right? Being open to say, hey, maybe I just learned something. Maybe this crazy thing is a fact. There are crazy things in the world, right? This is where science and metaphysics, physics and metaphysics, right? Physics can't explain everything. There are some things that just don't make sense. And religion has those things explained.
Yeah.
Right.
Ideas
Science
about them.
doesn't, right? And so often people gravitate toward that thing that has an explanation for this thing that we can't. Why do bad things happen to good people? We can't explain that, right? But religion does have some fail-safes to that. But so not everything is going to be verifiable, but most things are. And so
I'm thinking about an entirely new field of industry here, based on what you're saying. I mean, you think about, I have friends sometimes ask, what do you think my kids should do with their lives? Maybe they should get into critical thinking and analytics. I mean, I feel like that's going to be a huge, the next 50 years, it's going to have to be taught broadly.
Yeah.
That's nice, like where at least the humanities, they exist in a point where it's not about the absolute. That you might go, we're going to help you examine the absolute, because like religion is going to talk about the absolute science, but then in the humanities it doesn't claim to be like, I have it. It's like, I don't know, let's talk about it. Let's provoke ourselves about it and then see what comes as a product of that.
Absolutely, and have a dialectical conversation about it. We don't know what the truth is, but we want to have these competing ideas, and so this is that idea where personally, and this is just maybe how my brain is wired, but I distrust everything, right? Everything that I'm told, I distrust. Not to say, not in a conspiracy theory way, but that idea of like, well, you have to prove that to me if you're going, and that idea, but then having these conversations with one another, where we, and that idea of, but rather than convince somebody of something. Try, and I think this is maybe a very American thing, right? Think about our legal system, right? Where the idea is to just, so you're an accused murderer until a jury finds you guilty of murder, and then you're a murderer, right? The word is murderer. You're a murderer because you were found guilty of murder. That's the definition of murder. You're not a murderer because you killed somebody. You're a murderer because you were found guilty of killing. And so the idea of
then were you falsely convicted, maybe?
Right. And the idea of our legal system is it's there to come up with a result. It's not there to come up with the truth. It's not there to come up with what happened. We have two sides arguing. One side saying he didn't do it. The other side saying he did do it. They're not saying let's come together to figure out what happened. But like what we're saying is maybe we're better when we try to figure out what's going on rather than convince somebody of our side of the story.
Yes, and a perfect example of this in my mind is the COVID origination, right? It's like you're saying, you immediately distrust everything on first glance, and when this all happened, it was sort of like, well, we've got this lab here that develops this thing, but it didn't come from that. And then you have other people saying, well, obviously it came from that, right? But it took 2 years to get to the point of where now there's consensus on, we're pretty sure it came from there. You know what I'm saying?
The lab that was there to make COVID made COVID.
Right. When my 12-year-old kid sees it, what would you deduce from this? Well, it probably came from the lab. So
that's not what Reuters says, though.
Right. Well, that's not what they said originally, but I think. Yeah.
And then it's the idea of like how you weaponize information too, right? And so the idea, if we could just, the idea in a trial is you're not really trying to get to the answer. You're just trying to weaponize either certainty or distrust.
You've got the prosecutor with one point of view,
who's trying to say this is absolutely what happened, and then the defense who's trying to say, well, it could have been any old thing.
And whose job is it to figure out the truth?
Right.
The jury,
and so
the jury.
But and then once you to weaponize the idea of the Wuhan lab, right, was to say that this is if you say it comes from there, then what are the implications of that on larger discourses that we're having about COVID, right? And then these distractions from the center of the idea, which is, hey, there's this virus going around that's making people sick, but then we get so upset. But sometimes I think the way we use information makes us then not even want to think about what's right or wrong. Right? I don't even want to think about where the virus came from because the people who are saying it came from there are also saying these other things. Right? And so I'm not going to look critically at it. I'm not going to think about it logically. That the place where they developed these things was the first place it was witnessed, so maybe they made it. No, it can't be that.
Well, and everybody's got, we just like you said in court, it's about how can we align these facts so it's advantageous to us, and specifically like in the COVID thing, it's like everybody's has some reason why they'd like to not be clear about it. Because, like you said, if it's there and they did it, we also helped fund that research. So it's like there's plenty of people who don't want to take that responsibility. And yeah, I mean, it's very worrisome. I mean, in my head, and that's kind of what you actually nailed it on the head. Kind of like where our goal and vision for this podcast is not to have answers and be like, here's what we want. I want you, our audience, to think. It's here's some Dr. Jellenik, here's this person, and we're gonna have these conversations, and then hopefully people can just draw some conclusions of their own or be thought provoked.
Life, in today's world, will require critical thinking and analytics to
Absolutely.
It's like to use that sort of metaphor again about a trial. You have this point of view from the prosecutor, this point of view from the defender. The 12 people in the jury box are there to deduce the truth and figure out what happened.
Yeah.
And ultimately sometimes you don't know, and that's where you have to do the best you can with what's in front of you.
Yeah, yeah, and there are literally other forms of justice, other justice systems that work differently, right? Where they are trying to understand what happened.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than adversarial, it is where the defense and the prosecution work together to try to put together the most likely scenario. There are obvious problems to that system too for corruption, right? But yeah, that idea of like, hey, let's try to figure this out rather than, hey, I'm going to yell at you my ideas, and then you yell at me your ideas, right? And when that happens, neither of us listen to one another's ideas, and we both walk away saying, agree to disagree.
A little too adversarial, I think,
right.
for any type of good outcome.
Yeah,
right?
But the idea of the dialectic is you have thesis, antithesis, antithesis, and they smash into each other. And when they do, something else shoots out, which is a third way, right? And so that idea of like always thinking about, when we think about the world in polemic ways, in binary ways, binary opposition, you're either this or you're that, you're left or you're right, then we tend to have that adversarial system where the conversations don't really lead anywhere.
No, they don't.
And I think the internet is also developed in order to do that, right?
Yeah.
The echo chambers and the siloing that we have is there to make you think that your way of seeing things is right, the other way of seeing things is wrong, and you're not going to talk to those people because they're crazy. Right? And both sides are saying that, and so all you get is this feedback loop.
It's interesting, though. You have this minority of people who want to be in the middle and want to, and I find that percentage of society is starting to grow.
I think so, too.
Which is good. Trying to find, like you're saying, where the two work together.
Yeah.
Or
just need each other, have a mutual need for
or
each other.
and even if you don't agree, to at least hear one another, right? So to at least talk to one another and realize there are things you agree on, right? And so I think this is the huge fallacy that social media puts up, is it creates...
And news media too, right?
The social media and mainstream media create this idea of a completely divided America.
Yeah.
And I think we are divided on about 10 issues. Completely divided on about 10 issues. But I think there are about 1 million issues.
Yeah.
And I think on a lot of those issues, we all agree with one another. I have friends whom I have never voted for the same person as this person, and we're great friends.
Yeah.
Right? Because we agree on a lot of things, just not those 10 issues.
Yeah.
And if we make the whole world those 10 issues, then we will always fight.
Which is what the political system has done a good job of
exactly.
doing.
And so when we say, well, if you're this, and then we make the assumptions, the sort of shorthand stereotyping of people. So if you believe in this, then you must. It's the algorithm. It's how Amazon sells you things. Well, you bought this, you might also like this, right? You believe this, you must also believe that. And so we don't even talk to one another about these things that we probably do agree about, or at least are close enough that we can come up to maybe not consensus, but at least understandings of one another.
I kind of wonder, getting back to this topic about sort of the AI and all of that, like as we progress, will this idea of singularity, between technology and humanity, will that cause humanity to come together more and say, okay, now we've got sort of this other wave of evolution.
Or we'll all have my AI tells me this, and your AI tells you that.
Yeah, am I a human or am I a robot? Like that. So I do feel like there's some synthesis starting to happen on a human level, but there's still a broad gap there, for the most part.
You want to take a pause, reset, restart, re-record?
Sure, yeah.
We'll get to
and then we'll wrap up here in a minute.
Yep. Okay. So we've kind of so far talked about Quite a number of things, but definitely one thing we keep revisiting, it seems, is, and it again is your specialization, is this idea of adaptation, I'm sorry, and how really each one of us, through all these things, obviously there's culture and things we absorb, but then we each are our own adapter, and how we take life, we take the things we learn, and then we adapt them into our own thoughts, lives, and then we push them out. And one thing I was definitely thinking about at some points or another is, we've mentioned science, and a really good thing about cognitive models is like things like Newtonian physics. In this realm down here, this works. In another space, a different dialectic works. And we often are not okay with different dialectics existing at the same time in our minds. So I feel like that's where a lot of, inner conflict or social conflict happens. And, kind of in the break we were talking about a little bit more about what we talked about earlier, about like the Bible and different versionings, and then again our relationship to it, and we kind of wanted to guide the talking points back there.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about adaptations without talking about that. Probably the most adapted book of all time, right? So, I guess a little bit of your lens on that, right, and sort of its early nature in the world, and also it's some of its aggregations that came from other places. And what is your point of view on that? Do you talk about it in your class at all?
I don't really talk about it in my class, but I do think about it in my approach to adaptation. So one of the things I think is really interesting about adaptation is it's everywhere, right? But it's only in cultural adaptation that we have this idea that the new version of something is somehow less than the older versions. In almost, say, biological adaptation. Think about adaptation and evolution, right? We would never say, I miss our tail, right? It was really fantastic when we went around on all fours before we went upright. That was how I want to be now, right? We think about it, or a plant, right? We're like, or short-necked giraffes, right? We think about any biological change, evolution, which is adaptation, as good because it better suits a new environment. Right, and it is by necessity successful if it continues. It's only in cultural adaptation that we'll look and say, oh, you changed it and it's not as good, right? And so with regard to
it's gotten too far from the source, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But with regard to what we're talking about with spiritual texts, that adaptation happens so organically in the past that we just consider it to be a good thing, right? Yeah. And so as these things change, but it's still the same process. Over time, things change to better suit people and an environment, right? They better fit that world. If they don't, then they fall out of use, right? And so
or they become adapted.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And so it's as humans, that's what we do. We adapt and then we thrive, right? That's adaptation. It is something changing to thrive in a new environment. And so as religion successfully adapts, right? As idea systems shift, as you go from Judaism to Christianity, right? As then these things are necessarily sort of recomposed, reconstituted, but what I would call adapted, right? Or versioned.
Even from early, oral histories, I think most, probably all, significant spiritual religious movements started as stories, right? And then eventually someone wrote them down, and who wrote them down at first, who knows, but then they got changed and altered and
translated. And then in the translation they get changed. And then thinking about, say, the Bible, there's a canon, right? So we have a literary canon, which is what I teach. I don't only teach the canon, but the term canon comes from the attempt to develop a Bible. There's so many books, ancient books, only some, so we have the King James version of the Bible, right? That was a canon project. A bunch of religious scholars and priests got together to say, okay, these are the books that go in it, and these ones don't. That is a process of adaptation. You're leaving some things out, you're putting in others.
Decisions were
exactly.
made, yeah.
And as you translate from Aramaic to Latin to English, you're changing things, you're adapting things. And so, and those changes you have to believe were for a reason.
Yeah.
And those decisions, those editorial decisions, canonical decisions, were for a reason and fit the society that they were going into. And so when you look at these, and then as those stories get retold or repurposed, or as you encounter them on the internet, right? So if you look up a Bible quote, right, you might get an interpretation of that quote, a modernization.
Yeah.
It's put into, but anytime you modernize something, right, you're versioning it, you're adapting it. And so, that these things are constantly under negotiation, these stories. So, and we thought we were getting rid of, so when they translate, the Wycliffe Bible is the first one in English. They translate it into English, and you think, oh, there it is. But you're like, no, because you translated it from Latin, which was translated from Aramaic,
right?
And so it was already twice translated. It was originally an oral story, and so and then there were the canon projects that decided what got in and what didn't, and so and so on and so forth, and down to how we use it in our lives, which is another adaptation that each of us will undergo. Well, I have tattoos, right? Deuteronomy says not to have tattoos, but I have tattoos, right? I eat shrimp, right? Okay, Deuteronomy says not to eat shrimp, right? But these are the things that I think, okay, but these are okay to do, but these other things aren't okay to do. Who's to decide? Well, we are. Right? Society is. And as we go along, you almost never hear anybody quote, well, the Bible says it's a sin to have a tattoo, right? You don't see people like picketing a tattoo parlor, right? It's not something.
That church probably exists if you want to be a part
probably,
of it, right?
But it's not something we've grabbed onto as a society, but there are all kinds of other things that we have grabbed onto from these books as a society. And so they must fit something that we care about, something that we or we find useful, back to the power issue.
Well, that's part, I think, of what we were sort of talking about earlier, is that the power, religion uses power, and you look at that.
It's a power system.
Early days of just Christianity as an example, a world government was having a little bit of problem with some people that were revolting, right? And it's sort of, well, how can we use this to our advantage? And then you have that early versioning start to happen.
Absolutely.
Now, as far as the oral stories go, have you taught or read much about that? How these stories start out sort of unwritten, and then who decides to write them down? And that could be across literature or religion, because obviously whether you look at Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam or Christianity, there are some stories that are kind of early stories of human history across all of them that are very similar.
Absolutely. I've taught world literature where you really get into this quite a bit because the most ancient texts that we have are religious texts, right? And are versions of cosmogony, right? The creation of the world and our place in it, right? And so whether it's the Babylonian creation epic or Genesis, right? And they tend to be similar, right? And so, this idea of these ancient stories as they circulated, and then as systems of writing. And I think we often don't think about writing as a technology, but it is, right? You talked about the technology of the printing press. But writing itself is a technology. Right? The ability to write something down. Socrates believed it was going to destroy our memory. Wow. Right? And so we don't read anything.
And now we have Wikipedia.
Exactly. Socrates never wrote anything. Plato wrote about Socrates, and so we have Socrates as a character in Plato. But Socrates didn't believe in writing things down because he believed that if you wrote things, and I think now with technology we kind of see that, don't we? Where it's like, all right, who was that actor in that movie? And instead of remembering it, what do?
IMDb.
We Google it, right? We Google it right away. We IMDb it, and we don't have to remember anything. But either way, writing is a technology. And so at some point, but once you write something down, it's like you're pinning the butterfly to the wall, right? Before that, it was just a butterfly flying around. It could be anything. These stories, these oral stories, whether it's the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were oral stories, or fairy tales, which were oral stories, or the Gospels.
Yeah, or the Norse myths, right?
Yeah, all of these things begin with an oral tradition and then are written down. And the way I see it is anytime it's written down, it's for a purpose, right? And so why was it written down and how was it used?
That gets back to that analytical aspect. What is the purpose of this, right? Yeah,
definitely. Like, what's crazy to me is, especially going up to a place where the King James Bible was
Mhm.
essentially the law,
Right.
the end all, right? It was so interesting to see that like people they listen to these stories and they don't realize their brain's doing it. Is they've suspended their belief, right?
Mhm.
They've ingested this story, and then most of the time they're thinking about it in a way of like what its symbols are and how it can relate to something they need to do in their current life. But when you actually go to talk about the thing itself, right, the script or the text, it becomes it's more important about the literalness of it. So it's like we actually are reading it in order to digest something, but when you actually say, well, just read it for the digestion, stop. You don't need it for it to be literal. The point of it's being there is so that you digest something. There's a lot of pushback on that, at least where I come from.
Yeah, that confuses me as a literature person, I guess. The concept that you could read the Bible literally is, I find, just confounding, right? Because okay, in the Gospels, Jesus says to the apostles, "We shall be fishers of men." If you are reading the Bible literally, if it's literal, you must then believe that they walked out on the street with fishing poles
Right.
and tried to catch men. Of course nobody believes that. You believe that it's a metaphor.
Well, almost all of those red letters in the Gospels, which are Jesus' words, almost all of them are parables.
And he speaks in parables.
Almost always.
Parables are metaphoric
Yeah.
language and speech and ideas. And so, yeah, the idea that you could ever pin the Bible down in literal terms, to me, is folly, right? But and so in my mind, you're picking and choosing what you mean by literal.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying this is literal because it told us to do this and it means this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to throw out everything else,
Right.
Yeah.
which I can't read literally because it is a figurative text. That's what it is.
Well, it's
But-
hard to take 50 some odd books all
Yeah.
within the same context, right? I mean,
but the idea of I feel like people pull out the literal thing as a cudgel, right? You'll beat people over the head with it because you want them to have these three ideas literally,
yeah.
and the rest of it, but you don't want them to question anything. So you say, no, you must believe in the literal truth of this. To my mind, that doesn't make any sense. So
Right.
yeah, thinking about it as a metaphorical text.
Well, that was one of the earliest debates, right, in Christianity, which caused the Great Schism, the idea of the Trinity.
Yeah.
You know, and sort of what that is. And
yeah.
do we take it literally, or what was
And the
he-
Eucharist, yeah. And so the idea of like, is this Jesus' body?
Yeah, or not.
Right.
Or is this figuratively?
Yeah.
You know, and so the Protestants were like, no, it's not really Jesus'
Right.
body, and the Catholics were like, yes, no, it is, and this is transubstantiation.
Yeah.
This is the miracle, right? That it is the body and blood of Christ, literally, not just this is what it stands for in
Yeah.
church today,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, that's the schism,
Yeah.
right there. It's still today.
Yeah.
People get upset
I
about
just
it.
love this idea of there always being sort of what you're talking about, the idea of canon. There's always councils. There's groups that decide these
group of
things.
dudes sitting in a room.
And you kind of have to decide for yourself on all of this stuff. It's that idea of, having the analytical skills to determine for yourself what it means for you. And
Mhm.
I think that's part of the magic of all spiritual texts. It's sort of like, it's a personal idea between you and that, and what is it for you, right?
Yeah,
So,
but that gets in the way of the power, doesn't it?
It can.
Right, and so
Yeah.
it makes it harder for an organized religion to wield power
That's
over
right.
people if you. And this is what the Catholics were afraid of
Yeah.
when they translated
Right.
the Bible. They're
Yeah.
like, you realize you're letting the genie out of the
that's when
bottle
you're like,
here.
well, yes, I'm a Catholic, but I don't really go to mass,
Mhm.
and I
Yeah.
wasn't.
I'm just gonna, it's a make your own adventure here,
Right.
and I'm gonna pick and choose, and
Yeah.
and I think that's what most of us do
Yeah.
with our spirituality, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of organized religion, this is a threat, an existential threat.
Yeah.
If you could just decide what is right and what's
Self-determination,
not right, and
Yeah.
what parts of this religion are okay and what parts of it aren't, then what the heck are we for,
Right.
right?
Well, what's interesting is definitely, and this is true of any, I feel like, in literary experiences, like sometimes when something horrific is there, whether it's in a text or in a movie, it's not because that person is trying to say, here's this idea, glorify this idea. It's there for you to gauge how you react. Because you mentioned it, tell your students, pay attention to how you react and why do you think that way, what interests you. And so some of the things, like I think definitely in mythological texts, let's say, especially in Greek mythology or even parts of the Old Testament, there's incest, right? The point of that incest is not for it to be like, well, it was in the Bible, so it's okay for me to do it. The point is, like, how do you react to that? When you hear that idea, is it a literal incest or is it the crossbreeding of two ideas, right? it's very astounding when people aren't able to, they'll just read something horrible and say, well, that's horrible. Well, maybe that's why it was there, for you to kind of get, like, that's a good thing that you feel that way in response to that. It means you have a human being, you have a heart, and, you know, you feel bad about that type of stuff. But I think that, especially movies today, like, you see something horrible and you're like, well, it's a bad movie because that shouldn't be on television, right?
Yeah, a racist. If there are racist things in a movie, does that make it a racist movie? Or is it critiquing racism, right? And so this is where the critical thinking comes in. If there's a character who's sexist in a movie, if there are sexist ideas in this movie, and then it becomes up to us as the consumer of that product, as somebody who's watching it and engaging with it, are those ideas being sanctioned? Is this racism or sexism how I'm supposed to feel, or is it supposed to upset me? Is it supposed to horrify me? Is the violence here? This is a debate about Tarantino's violence. Is he using violence to titillate people and glorifying it? Or is he using violence to call attention to the violence in our society and make us question these uses of violence? You can go either way with Tarantino. I know people who do. But so that idea, it's only critical thinking that will allow us to come up with either response. And so when you see something in a movie that you don't like, but I think we should also think about the things that we do like in a movie too, right? If you love this, so when my students say, the first thing I'll ask is, hey, so what'd you think? What'd you think about it? And I do want them, it's not an evaluative class. We're not gonna say, okay, this was a good movie, this was a bad movie. I don't really care whether they think it was a good or bad movie, but I do want them to say, oh, I liked it or I didn't like it, or I like this part, I didn't like that part.
Tell me why.
The next question is always why.
Yeah.
And the things that you don't like, there's a reason. But the things that you do like, you also want to explore. Why was I so drawn to that part? Why does this idea really, we want to think about that too critically, right? Not just, these are the things that please me, so I don't have to think about them. These are the things that displease me, I'm going to think about them. I think we should think about the things that please us too. What is it about that idea? And maybe we can be like, well, maybe that isn't such a great idea, and why does it make me so happy, right? Or we can think about ways in which it is productive. And I think that filters into religion too, right? These ideas of like, why are you so drawn to these specific aspects of a religion, and what do they give to you, right? This is how they adapt, and how they find traction on the ground is people are called to it and then feel like it gives them something. What is it? What is it giving you?
That's the problem with censorship, right? Because like if you, in order to graduate ourselves ethically and morally, we think we'll have to remove all the bad stuff, right? Versus, then you don't even get the chance to explore that topic, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't actually look at it and confront it because you're worried about being horrified by the fact that it exists.
Yeah. Or the erasure, never say gay, right? The idea of like total erasure of the ability to talk about something in the human experience, right?
There's a lot of erasure occurring in culture today, I feel, across the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Attempts for it, and a lot of it is that editorializing of information.
Yeah, and that's the worst way, right? It's the opposite of what we were talking about as the dialectic, right? It's the worst way to deal with the things you disagree with, is to pretend they don't exist and to insist that others pretend that as well, right? That's the opposite of critical thinking, right? Because, it's just the idea that, we'll just, pay no attention. Yeah. Just the man behind the curtain, we just won't pay attention to it. Whatever the issue that you're made uncomfortable by, I think it's one of the horrible sayings of our time. Yeah. Is that makes me uncomfortable. Because I think that's exactly the stuff that you should be talking about. I mean, there's uncomfortable and uncomfortable, right? But the idea of this challenges my ideas, I therefore don't want to talk about it.
Right.
I find that problematic. And so, but often we'll say, well, this makes me uncomfortable. And then everybody has to shut down.
Right.
Okay, no,
we can't talk about that.
We won't talk about it. We'll just walk away. And that leads to, again, like you were saying, a lot of erasure, editorializing, and that echo chamber. Well,
I get these, ideas in my head of the future if we continue down this path. And it looks like the Truman Show, or some other
Mm-hmm.
Gattaca, some other very sterile,
Yeah.
undesirable version of the future.
Yeah.
Right? Where we might as well be robots ourselves.
Yeah. And we have to be able to say unpopular and offensive things in a way, because otherwise
Discourse is required, right?
Yeah.
That's where comedy is coming in handy these days.
Yeah.
The fact that we can just, no matter what the comedian or the audience's thoughts is, we can just kind of pick it apart and find some ways to laugh at ourselves for how serious.
And it's always what comedy's been for.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
As far back as comedy goes, to the court jester in ancient times was the person who was allowed to tell the truth to the king.
Roasted the king, right?
Yeah, but in a way that wasn't
Yeah.
actually calling him out on a specific issue.
If you go too far, you get your head cut off.
Yeah,
Right?
but you were the only one who was allowed to do it, and it was the comedian.
Yeah.
Right.
Bible calls us prophets.
Yeah.
The guy that walked up to the king and said, "Hey, you're acting kind of silly right now."
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, because it's one of the most they're both of an uncomfortable set of movies, because he's a strange mind himself. Is are you familiar with Alejandro Jodorowsky?
No.
Okay, so you've never seen like Holy Mountain or else. Okay, well, that's a great recommendation. So we can't necessarily go there, but he's a very interesting filmmaker, kind of avant-garde, and a lot of his stuff wasn't mainstream, but it's from like the 70s.
Oh, okay.
I'll send you a link about
Yeah,
it.
Kind of a
definitely
weird.
do.
He was sort of a weird aggregator. You watch his
Yes.
stuff, and you're sort of like, he's got all kinds of ideas.
Yeah,
A lot of
exactly.
places.
And some of them are uncomfortable. I mean, some of what he did wouldn't really be okay for
Is
film
he?
today.
Where's he from?
I believe he's from somewhere in South America. I
Yeah.
want to say like Colombia or something like that. He grew up there, and then I think he went to Mexico, and then on to the United States.
Okay.
Very interesting person, and then a couple of his.
He
films-
actually had his own version of Dune, which was never made.
Oh,
Yes.
funny.
There's a
He wrote
lot
a
of
script.
yeah,
I
like
forgot
a
that's how
third
it's-
version. Yeah, there's tons of pre-production images, visuals, and his writings on it that he wanted to make. It's pretty cool. If you check that out, you'll
Right.
be like, wow, I wish I had seen this version of the movie as well.
Interesting.
Holy Mountain is just a wholly other movie entirely, but like most of the half of the film is not even, there's nothing being spoken, it's just kind of watching stuff play out, and he's constantly moving, using all these symbols. So yeah, I think
A lot
you
of
would definitely
symbology
enjoy
and-
that
Mhm.
movie.
No, I'll check it out.
And the ending
Jodorowsky?
itself is, yeah, it's Alejandro Jodorowsky.
Jodorowsky. Okay.
But the ending, especially in that movie, is just so bizarre.
Once you do your research and come back, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
would
we could do a
absolutely.
podcast on
There will be a test.
Jodorowsky.
Glad you were here today. It's really, it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, it was my
You know.
pleasure. I really enjoyed.
Anything else you want to cover?
No, random factoids that I
Yeah.
did want to mention is when I was doing a little background on you, I did look at your Rate My Professor.
Oh,
Have you ever
God.
looked at your Rate from My Professor?
No.
It's actually pretty good.
Is it?
I think a 5.0 is not good because that means everybody thinks you're easy.
Oh, okay.
All over.
Right. Oh, so
you're
I don't have a 5.0.
You're
4.4. Okay.
I actually think that's one of the best scores. You have 0 lowest rating scores.
Okay.
So nobody just thought
Nobody
you were
was.
terrible.
Nobody
right?
flamed me.
It's good.
I think 4.5 means the professor challenged you and your
Mhm.
work was hard, but you loved it, right? So
Right,
it's
right, right.
difficult, but then great.
Okay.
So yeah, like that's what I thought about you as well. It's very engaging and challenging. So he's a great professor. If you go to UCA, you should definitely get Professor Jellenik. And then also, I found you on the Conway Advocates for Bicycling.
Oh yeah.
Says you, and I do remember you bicycling to work every day. I'd be walking up South Boulevard, and so you go whizzing by.
Yep.
And you also coach wrestling at Conway High School.
Yeah. Not anymore. I stopped when my son graduated. But yeah, I was a wrestler in college.
Wow.
I know, right?
You're a love veranda fighter.
Yeah. And coached in New York and coached in Delaware, and then when we moved out here, coached at Conway for 5 years.
Nice.
And it's fun. It's a fun sport. And my son did it, and it was a way for us to spend some time together.
There you go. Now you have more time to teach, right?
Exactly. It was super time consuming.
Yeah.
My wife did not enjoy the time consuming aspect of it, but yeah. So yeah, I coached and love coaching. I coach baseball as well.
Oh, nice.
Cool.
Not at Conway though. Their team's too good for me to coach.
All their teams are good. Aren't they?
Yeah.
So before we wrap this up, is there any like upcoming projects or any work you want to talk about, like you're working on right now, or is upcoming, or do you have anything you want to point people to, like your website or any?
Oh, I don't even have a website. You saw me text. I text like once every week. I'm not a big technology guy, so I don't have a website. But UCA is doing really interesting things. It is a fantastic resource, and our department just merged with the language department, so we are now the School of Languages and Literatures. So anybody who's interested in the humanities in general, and who's going to UCA or thinking about going to UCA, swing by, check out what we've got. There are all kinds of fun things going on there, and in service of our conversation about developing critical thinking skills, I do think it is the thing that makes us human, right? The ability, we could all be machines, and AI is better than we are at so many things, but the ability to look at the world through a very specific lens and break it down in very specific ways tends to be something that is fundamentally human. And so anybody who's interested in those things and is at UCA, please come by, see me, talk to me, or take some classes over in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. There's all kinds of fun stuff going on there, and it is terribly valuable. Often as we think about things in like dollars and cents versions, right, and in quantifiable ways, we lose touch with these unquantifiable things like the ability to look at the world and think clearly about it, and be curious about it. So
Yeah,
that would be.
we would all be better off attending at least one of your classes.
I think so. That's what I tell everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, they got a kind of little bit of a free course today.
There you
that's
go.
right. Hopefully.
Yeah.
But no, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for coming back. I mean, I think we definitely would want to have you back on some point in the future and explore
Hey.
some of
Yeah.
these things that might take a little bit more time to unpack. But yeah, it's awesome to have you. Thank you for coming. Anything else, Johnny, before we close out?
No, I think it's great.
Alrighty. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks, everybody.
See you.